let's talk about exposure. All right, let's talk about exposure. Let's talk about that when you hit that shutter release, an exposure is made in your camera, and it has to be properly exposed. Now, you don't want it under, you don't want it over. You want to nail your exposure. All right? Are you going to do it every single time? No. You're going to go out and shoot a job and kind of blow exposure. You may underexpose everything. Okay. You may underexpose everything a bit or overexpose everything a bit or whatever, but your goal is you get a subject sitting in front of your camera, or you have something going on in front of your camera. You need to make a good exposure of that. All right? And that's aperture and shutter speed. Aperture and shutter speed. You're going to lock in at some ISO, and then it's aperture and shutter speed. Aperture and shutter speed. And the two go hand in hand. All right? And understanding how exposure is made, understanding how your camera thinks and what you're looking for is going to help you become consistent. All right? Become a consistent photographer. If I set a subject down over here and I'm going to take their picture, I'm going to take 100 pictures of them over here. Or I'm going to have 100 people. Like you were saying, you had to shoot headshots of all these people. Every time they sit in front of that camera, I want every single person that comes through in front of my lens to be properly and consistently exposed. So that when I go through all those pictures in post-production, my post-production life is easy. If you blow it on exposure in shooting, your post-production is hell. All right? You do not want to pull up 50 thumbnails in Lightroom or whatever you're working in, Aperture, Bridge, whatever. You pull 50 thumbnails up from a job, and these 3 look pretty good, and these 2 are overexposed, and these 2 are underexposed, and these look okay, and this one's, whoa, that one's blown, and this one's way under, and this one's, that's okay, and these 3 are salvageable, but oh, these 10 look beautiful, and now these are down. When you're seeing that exposure going up and down and up and down and up and down, and you have to bring all of those photographs into one consistent look, you're gonna have a very difficult time in post-production. Because to try to take a properly exposed photograph, all right, so we have a properly exposed photograph, and then we have one that's underexposed, and then one that's overexposed. And to get the underexposed level up and the overexposed level down, and to keep the contrast the same, the color the same, you know, the noise the same, and those 3 photographs, it's difficult to do. What I want to see is 50 photographs that pop up, and they're all consistently exposed. They're under one consistent exposure. And let's say it's just, okay, I got it a little off on the underside, or a little off on the overside. At least they're all a little off one way or another. Not a lot, I'm not talking about 3, 4 stops, but at least they're all off. So when I work on one, I go and just shoot that all through. And what we're going to eventually build up to when talking about exposure is why aperture priority sucks, especially for portraits. Aperture priority sucks, especially for portraits. All right, and we're gonna talk about shooting aperture priority versus manual versus shutter priority, things like that. And there are times for aperture priority. There are times I have to throw my camera in aperture priority, and I'm going with that. And there are times when I throw it, very few, but there've been a few times, like once a year, that I put it in shutter priority. Most of the time it's in manual, and we're gonna break that down. Okay, so some of you're gonna be like, yes, Zach, I get it, I know this crap. Okay, fine, just bear with us as we bring everyone up, because I promise you, there are working photographers with paid jobs on the books that still don't know this. Because I've met them over and over. And you think, what? Yes, I've met them over and over and over. Paid photographers, working photographers, full-time photographers that still don't understand aperture and shutter speed and their relationship with each other. It has to be something you understand. If you're sitting there going, yeah, I don't quite get it, then you have to get this. So let's break it down. We're not going to spend 4 days on it, so here we go. So we have apertures, right? And basically our aperture scale, we're going to start it at 1.4, all right? 1.4 2, 2.8, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, 22. Sometimes you might see an f32 somewhere along the range. You won't see 45 and 64 until you get into large format photography. For most of the time, we're working in this 1.4 to f22 range, all right? Now, Aperture controls the amount of light coming into the camera, the amount of it. If you go to a water faucet and you turn it full on and water is pouring out of it, that is an open aperture. A ton of water is coming through. If you turn it to just a drip, 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 the inside of that faucet is a small aperture and is allowing just a little bit of water through, all right? Large aperture, fully open faucet, closed down aperture, closed down faucet, a drip. This is just pouring out. This is just dripping out, all right? It's the amount. And as you open up in full stops, you are allowing twice as much light in or half as much light, all right? You're doubling the light or you're halving the light. And 1, 4, 2, 2, 8, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, 22. Now, when you see things like 3.5 on your camera, those are third stops, all right? So we're at 2.8. And then usually you'll see 3.2, 3.5, 4. Then 4, 4.5, 5.0, 5.6. The 5, or 4.5 and the 5.0 are third stops. That's fine tuning. We have full stops, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16. And then fine tuning exposure by third stops. It's like a cup of sugar, a cup and a third of sugar, a cup and 2/3 of sugar, 2 cups of sugar, all right? Now, this is how much crap is out in the photography world. I once met a photographer who was told by a master of photography who had all of their certification and was teaching a workshop that you should never use the third stop increments. Those are bad apertures to use. You should only use 2, 2.8, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11. You should never use 3.5. Or 4.5. You just shouldn't do that. It's such a load of crap. Like, it's just amazing that that stuff gets out there in the world. And if you don't know, you don't know. And someone comes along and they have some sort of air of authority about them and says, this is what you must not do, then you listen to them. But, so if someone's told you never to shoot at 3.5, like, because that's a bad aperture, whatever. Like, yes.
Would you say it would be a good learning tool, kind of like sticking with one modifier or one lens to learn, if you're just learning your apertures, to stick on full apertures for a while you're learning what those different effects are?
I guess in some ways that would be good, but it all depends on the light that you're in is going to determine, like, can you really stick to 2.8? You might be in full sun at 2.8 and you need to shoot at f4 because of whatever shutter speed or whatever you're using. I usually tend to think apertures and full stops because it's easy for me to calculate. Like when I'm at one exposure, but I need to jump to a different exposure and to figure out its reciprocal, I have a hard time going from 3.2 to 13, right? Because it's like, oh, those are thirds. Like, so I think 2.8 to 11 plus a third jump kind of thing. So I'm definitely, in my brain, I'm thinking full stops. And when my meter shows me 3.2 at 1/100th of a second, which are all now third increments, I'm just, okay, you know, I have to think a little extra. I don't like thinking extra. It is great to shoot all of your lenses, though, at all of your apertures, okay? Here's the thing, there's a sweet point in your lens that's somewhere in the middle of your aperture range, where it's going to be its sharpest. Now, I know some people are like, well, I shoot my such and such lens at f8 because that's the sharpest. Yeah, but your pictures could use a little shallower depth of field than f8. Well, it's sharper at f8. I need as sharp as possible. No, you know, I don't need to count pores on your subjects. Like, it's beautiful at 2.8. Well, it's not as sharp. Okay, of course it's not as sharp, but it's acceptably sharp. You know, It's just whatever. Like, okay, dude, you know, your mom's calling. It's dinner time. All right. Now, one thing I usually avoid, and this is getting to know your lenses and shooting them all at all their apertures, is a lot of my lenses, especially my 24-2.8, at f22 is horrible. All the way closed down at f22, it just breaks apart. f16, it stays sharp. The contrast stays good. I don't get as many chromatic aberrations and weird optical things going on in my photographs. But when I take this lens and I shut it to f22, it's nearly useless. All right? So knowing your lenses, shooting them at each aperture is definitely recommended. And you can look at that. From f16 to f22, the thing falls apart. Now, some lenses, you go from, you know, you go up to 22 and it holds together okay. And you say, okay, this lens holds together at f22. This lens does not. And you get yourself in a situation, you got that 24 millimeter lens on, and you suddenly are metering at f22, and you go, nope, I gotta go to f16. I gotta figure this out at f16 and not 22 because I know my lens. Right? Know your lenses. Know your lenses. Know them. Know them. I used to have a Sigma 20 millimeter 1.8, and I thought this is going to be great. It's 1.8. It's 20 millimeter. It's fast. It's wide. This is going to be awesome. And it was sharp at 1.8 from the lens to about 2 feet. If I were to take a picture of you, Dave, here at 1.8 with that lens, this distance away, I had to shut it down to about 3.5 until you'd actually be sharp. And then what did I have? A 20 millimeter 3.5 lens. At 1.8, fine, we're good. I was shooting more shows back then, more live shows, so I thought I could shoot wide, I could shoot wide open, 1.8. But if I'm this far away from the lead singer up on stage and I'm shooting at 1.8, it's just soft. I called it my oatmeal lens because it was about as sharp as a bowl of oatmeal, right? And so I'd have to shoot 3.5, f4 for that lead singer this distance to be sharp. And so I just bought this 1.8 lens. It's really an f4 lens. Congratulations. Right? I hate that. Okay, so as we open up our aperture, or our f-stop, aperture, f-stop, aperture, f-stop, all the same, we're allowing more light into the lens. As we close it down, we're allowing less light into the lens. If you are trying to get X exposure into your camera, then the less light you have coming through the lens, the more time that light needs to enter the lens. And that's where we're going to get into shutter speed. Aperture is amount, shutter speed is time. So you have that faucet turning on and you have a glass of water. You put the glass underneath the faucet and you turn it full on, and your goal is to fill that glass all the way up. All right? So I get my glass of water. My goal is to fill it all the way to the top with water. I put it under the faucet, I turn it full on. Full on. It will not take much time for that cup to fill up. Right? I fill it up in 2 seconds, I take it out, I have a full cup of water. Now I take the cup, I put it under the faucet, and I turn my faucet on to f22, drop, 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 and my goal is to fill it with water. It is going to take me more time to fill it up. Let's say it takes me a minute to fill this thing up with water. And when I'm done, I still have a full cup of water. So I got to a full cup of water under 2 different ways. One took me 3 seconds, one took me 1 minute. What was the final product? A full cup of water. Final product was proper exposure. I got to proper exposure at one setting and proper exposure at another setting. We'll break this down in reciprocals coming right up. So the smaller the number, the larger the opening. That's what, like, as you're learning apertures, that's the one that doesn't make sense. The smaller the number, the larger the opening, the more light there is. The bigger the number, the smaller the opening. It's just sort of a weird thing. Just get it in your head. Don't try to understand it. There's math behind it. There is. It's all math. And I went to public school in the South. So how do you think I do with math? Probably not pretty good. All right. So the larger the opening, the shallower the depth of field. The depth of field, we're going to get into this even more coming up, but the depth of field is what is acceptable in focus and not, right? We have a shallow depth of field, so I focus on Dave and the whole background goes out of focus, or I focus in on you, I want a greater depth of field, and I focus on you and I have the background in focus. That is my depth of field. What area in the photograph is of acceptable sharpness in focus? All right, so, but it's not the only thing that affects depth of field. There are other factors in depth of field. It's not just your aperture. There's more to it than that. Aperture is typically the first technical aspect I think of when shooting. For portraits, I typically am wanting a shallow depth of field to bring the focus of the photo to the subject. So I am an aperture priority photographer in my brain. I'm thinking apertures most of the time first. I've got to take a picture of the three of you. I'm looking at the background, I'm looking at you, I'm looking at the background, I'm looking at you, and I'm trying to figure out, I want you in focus, how much do I want that background out of focus? And I'm thinking about my aperture, and then I'll figure out my shutter speed. All right? It's rare I think about shutter speed first. Most of the time I'm thinking aperture. So as a photographer, you're walking into a situation, there's all this stuff going through your brain, and you're going to think aperture. I have to take a picture of a subject. I need that subject to pop off of that photo. You guys are the viewers of my pictures, and I need to be the director of your eyes. And I need to pull out a picture and show it to you, and I need you to go exactly to the point in the photograph I want you to go to. And it's what's going to be lit and what's going to be in focus, and you're going to say, that is the subject. And I don't want anything else detracting from that subject. And how I use depth of field, and then we'll get into how I use light, or how I compose my photograph, is I'm taking your eyes and directing them to my subject in my photograph. So I think aperture a lot, because I think depth of field a lot. All right? We're going to get through shutter speed here, and we're going to take a little break. So for those of you sitting in front of your computer going, shut up, Zach, we need to take a break. We'll get there. So shutter speed is time. Most of our cameras go to 8,000th of a second. Fast shutter speed, 8,000th of a second. And we take it down here to 1 second. We are doubling time, or we're cutting time in half, right? Just like apertures, we are adding twice as much light or cutting the light in half. For those of you into flash, you double your flash power, you get 1 stop of light. You cut your power in half, you lose 1 stop of light. You cut your time in half, you lose a stop of light. You double your time, you get 1 stop of light. A stop of light is all about doubling and halving. That's pretty easy math. I can handle that. If I can handle it, you can handle it, kind of thing. All right, so 8,000th, 4,000th, 2,000th, 1,000th of a second, 500th of a second, 2/50th of a second, 1/25th, 60th, 30th, 15th, 1/8, quarter. Then we get half a second, 1 second. Then it goes 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds. Sometimes your cameras will go 15 seconds, not 16 seconds, but 15. And then 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 4 minutes. You're shooting like the North Star. For our friends in Antarctica in the winter who are tuning in, you'll be out there with, 3-hour-long exposures. If you're at a 3-hour exposure and you need an extra stop of light, you now have to expose for 6 hours. Think about that. It's doubling time. So a 3-hour exposure, whatever you're doing with that, a 3-hour exposure and you need 1 more stop of light, that is now a 6-hour exposure. Joe McNally did a series of photos out in the desert for National Geographic, and they'd go out all night long shooting in the desert, and they might get 4 or 5 shots done because they would open that shutter for an hour. And they then look at it and go, okay, I need another stop of light. Well, what does that mean? That means 2 hours to get another stop of light. All right. So these are all numbers, and you need to plant these in your head. Like your phone number, like your address, like your kids' ages, like your shoe size. Like you just need to know. You need to know from 1,000 to 500 is 1 stop of light. 1,000 to 250 is 2 stops of light. 1,000 to 125 is 3 stops of light. And here's what happens. So people ask me a lot, should I go to photography school? Should I go to photo school? You know, you can have a career and run a business without going to photo school. I am the kind of person that I need to be shown and taught and tested to learn something. I can't just pick up a book or just watch a 2-hour tape and just go with it. I need it to be demonstrated in front of me, and then really I need to be pushed and be tested on it. So the beauty about going to photography school for me is all of this stuff here, we were tested on it. Like your multiplication tables, right? 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6. And we were tested, so we'd be sitting there, we'd have a get out of, you know, piece of notebook paper, and then you'd say, okay, you're at ISO 100 at 60th of a second at 2.8, what is your shutter speed at 5.6? You have to write it down. What is now your shutter speed at f8 but ISO 400? Write it down. And we'd be tested and tested and tested on it. And we would have to make reciprocal tables, all right? And so all of these numbers, our apertures, our ISOs, our shutter speeds, they were just drilled into our head at photography school. Now, how many of you, I'm going to go back to that real quick. How many of you have the discipline to sit down at your dining room table and write out reciprocal matrices? How many of you are going to do it? How many sexy blog posts is that? Hey guys, today I sat down and I just wrote reciprocals all day. And wow, I really know the difference, you know, between 1/8 of a second and 8,000th of a second. Now I can count those stops out in my brain. No, like, that's not the fun part. The fun part is the shooting. The fun part's the making the magic happen. But for me, without knowing the numbers, like, I can't go be the shooter that I need to be. Without sitting and understanding, like, I'm looking at the back of my camera or I'm looking at my light meter and I know a change needs to be made. I know where that change needs to go. I know which direction it needs to happen. I know which button to push on my camera or which dial to turn. And so when I'm looking at the back of the camera, or I'm looking at my light meter and I say I need to make a change, I know where that change needs to go. That change happens and I keep shooting. And I'm trying to stay away from, like, oh God, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. I know what to do. And again, it comes out, I want to run a successful business, then run a camera successfully first. It's all this crap. You can't sex up numbers. I'm sorry, just can't. There's a quote. All right, so aperture controls how much light enters the camera. Shutter speed controls for how long the light enters the camera. The faster the shutter, the sharper the image. All right, you are photographing a moment of time. And I'm going to capture 8,000th of a second of time of something in front of my camera. So somebody's running by. 8,000th of a second of them, they're sharp. If I shoot someone running for 1 second, 1/1000th, that amount of movement across the sensor is going to blur, right? So the slower the shutter speed, the more blur I am more likely than not going to get. The faster the shutter speed, the less of a blur or shake or something that I will get. The sharper the picture is going to be. The longer the shutter speed, the more likely my focus is going to get blown. Not really my focus, but just motion blur, all right? So the rule of thumb is you can hand hold, all right? You can hand hold a camera at 1 over your focal length. Now the rule of thumb out there is you can hand hold it at 60th of a second or faster. 1/60th of a second or faster. But really it is 1 over your focal length. So if you have a 200 millimeter lens, you're shooting with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens and you're zoomed into 200 millimeters, you are magnifying the image in your viewfinder and onto your sensor. You're magnifying it with a 200 millimeter lens. And not only are you magnifying the image, you are magnifying any movement, right? So if I take this camera, take the 35 off of it, and I put this on it, 200 millimeter, and I focus in on you, Ray. As I'm back here focusing, I'm not dead still. There's a little bit of movement. And the more magnification that's going on with my lens, the more that movement is magnifying. You ever take a powerful set of binoculars and try to look at something far away and start to get seasick? Because everything in your vision is just kind of floating everywhere. If you're needing high-powered magnification, you go to a spotting scope on a tripod. You know. Now, if you go wide angle, if I come in here with a fisheye, a 10 millimeter fisheye, you're not seeing a whole lot of movement because it's just so dang wide. I can go to a slower shutter speed, handheld, with a wide angle than I can with a 200 or whatever. Oh, also note, the bigger the lens you go on here, the heavier this gets. The heavier this gets, the harder it is to hold still. So if I'm, say, at a wedding, and I'm shooting the ceremony, and I'm in the back of the church, and it's dimly lit, and I see my shutter speed starting to dip below 200th of a second, then I know, like, oh, I better watch out. Because at 200 millimeter, I'm most likely going to start getting motion blur under 200th of a second. So I have to get a strong stance, wide stance with the feet, a good firm grip on the lens and the camera, and I smash this thing into my face. And I make as many points of contact, this camera, to my body and try to hold still if I don't have a tripod or a monopod or some other support system. You can do the whole origami Joe McNally like thing that he does. Like, he's got this thing he does, like Joe does, and he packs this thing into his shoulder, he brings his arm up around it, maybe it's like this, and you know, he'll shoot this lens at 30th of a second. You can go slower, totally go slower, but it's a skill set of learning how to shoot slow shutter speeds and keep it sharp. And it sounds stupid, but just like you need to sit in your dining room and make reciprocal tables, you need to sit there watching American Idol on your couch or whatever and be shooting your cat across the room and say, I'm going to shoot my cat at 15th of a second and get it sharp, handheld. So when the commercials come on, you got something across the room, and I'm going to shoot a picture of those suitcases over there, and I want it to be sharp at 200 millimeter at an 1/8 of a second. I'm going to figure it out. And I've sat on my couch many a time just sitting there and say, okay, I want to get this. I want it. My thing is I breathe in, I hold it, I smash this thing deep into my face, and then just click. And I try to pull it off.
Zach,
it is something you can learn.
Hey, Zach, I just want to say I've seen your wedding photography. You're an incredible wedding photographer.
Oh, well,
I'm just saying.
it's all right. I like what I do.
I did have a question for you about that from Twitter, and it's from Beto. And could you ask Zach about the rule of thumb for 1/4 focal length with regard to crop lenses? So how does that apply? Do you have to think about it as the
Kind of like
the crop factor?
Not really, because the crop factor, the crop isn't optically making it a 300. You're just seeing part of the 200. It's still optically a 200 millimeter lens. It hasn't optically really changed to a 300 millimeter lens if it's a 1.5 crop factor. You're just seeing less of it. If you could take that chip out and put a full frame in it, it's still optically the same lens, right? So it's still kind of the same rule of thumbs. All right. I'm being told we need to take our little break here. So a 28 millimeter lens, I'll hand hold that at 30th of a second or faster and not really think much about it. When I go to a 200 millimeter lens, I'm trying to get my shutter speed to 250th of a second. I really don't want to be below that. And I know myself, a big heavy lens like that, at 250th, I got it. You can still get a little motion blur at 250th of a second with a 200 millimeter lens. If you're at 1,000th of a second, you're golden, you're good. You're perfect, right? So when I'm looking through the back of that camera, I'm metering, and I'm a 200 millimeter lens, and I'm at 60th of a second. Then I have to make a change. By how much? 2 stops. You need to calculate that. Oh, I'm at 60th, I need to be 250th. That's 2 stops. I'm at ISO 100, 200, 400, 2 stops of light, bam, ISO 400, 250th of a second, 2.8, and I'm going. That's how my brain's working. And when you're at 60th of a second at 2.8, and you're like, oh wait, I need a faster shutter speed. But how many stops is that? And how do I get there? And you go to 250, and now it's too dark, and oh no, it's too dark, and I can't open up my aperture anymore. I'll just shoot, and I'll just fix it later. No, you're not going to just shoot and fix it later. You're going to fix it now, all right? So if I want, and I feel like I just found this website, lostmodel.tumblr.com. Because see, this whole girl in a field with a suitcase thing has now become such a cliche that like I have to like get these pictures out of my life. Because I've shot now a girl with a suitcase. But this was for a job, this was for a red campaign. And it was shot for a specific reason. She had to have this suitcase. And now I'm like, now it's become, anyways. So it's a girl in a suitcase. I know that internet and don't make fun of it because I make fun of it myself. So I need motion to stop, fast shutter speed. I need to show movement, slow shutter speed. There are plenty of times I just throw that thing on a slow shutter speed because I want motion, I want movement. The rule of thumb is that's a bad portrait. But if that's inside CD artwork that text has to drop over, that works. Or if I'm trying to convey some emotion or movement, it's hard to convey movement when everything is just dead sharp. It looks frozen. You want to convey movement. You want to convey that bride is going down the aisle. Go to a slow shutter speed. Show that blur of that dress going down the aisle. Move back up to a fast shutter speed and get it, because, you know, your client may, why am I all blurry? I'm an artist. Shut up. All right. I shoot bands, and one of my goals is to shoot bands to where, like, if you knew this band, you could call them out by name. Like, you can still recognize them, but there's still this blur. Because if text had to get dropped over this, you could still read sharp text over a blurred background. So I'm always thinking about, okay, they need a portrait. I, of course, shot this portrait of them sharp, but then I shot it moving my camera at a slow shutter speed, like 1/8 of a second, to get some blur. And then the graphic designer will have two options. Well, I've got the picture of them sharp, but I have it also blurred. And I tell you, if you do the blurring in camera, it looks better than doing it in post-production. You can usually tell, oh, you put a motion blur in Photoshop on that. You know, my goal is, if I want a motion blur on it, I do it with my camera. How do I do it with my camera? I go to a slower shutter speed. And the picture of them sharp and the picture of them blurry are the same exposure. And when we get back from the break, we're going to talk about reciprocals. Just quickly, panning, using a slow shutter speed while following a moving subject. We see our subject stays sharp, but everything else is kind of moving. So I'm using a slow shutter speed, and we're like 1/15 of a second or slower. And as my subject is moving, I'm moving the camera with them. And my goal is they stay in the same spot on the sensor, but everything else is blurring past the sensor. So what my sensor sees, if I get my timing correct, is she stays at the same part of that sensor, thus staying relatively sharp. But all of this, you know, everything else that's not moving is visually moving across my sensor. So it blurs and she stays sharp here, okay? Shutter speed, this kind of stuff is where, like, ooh, shutter speed. I'm thinking shutter speed more than aperture. I'm not worried about depth of field in those pictures. I'm worried about shutter speed because I want motion, I want movement, I want the blur. And I'm going to introduce that into my photographs. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a quick break for 10 minutes or something. I'm going to bounce back to you ladies on that. We're going to take a break, and we're going to come back into reciprocals and the relationship these two have together.